Today, we're going to dive into the story of Father Gabriele Amorth. He was the Vatican's most famous exorcist, a man who claimed he battled the devil, literally, tens of thousands of times. But his life was a constant war, not just against what he called demons, but against modern science, and maybe most surprisingly, against his own church. To really wrap your head around the sheer scale of Father Amorth's work, you have to start with this number: 160,000. By 2013, that's how many exorcisms he claimed to have performed. I mean, it's a figure so huge, it almost sounds impossible, right? And it immediately makes you ask, what was he actually counting? And yeah, people were skeptical right away. Catholic apologist Jimmy Akin did the math on an earlier claim of 30,000 and pointed out just how absurd it sounded. And this really gets to the heart of the mystery of Amorth. Was he a spiritual warrior fighting a battle we can't even begin to imagine? Or was something else going on here? So, to unpack all of this, here's our plan. We'll start with his official job in Rome and look at his pretty unlikely path from soldier to priest. Then, we're going to examine the war he fought inside the Vatican, dive into that tricky line between possession and psychiatry, and finally, try to figure out his complicated and, let's face it, controversial legacy. Okay, first things first, let's get clear on who he actually was. The media loved to throw around a certain title, but the reality was a little more down to earth. All right, let's clear up a big misconception right off the bat. He was not the Pope's exorcist. That's pretty much a media invention. He was appointed back in 1986, and his official title was Exorcist for the Diocese of Rome. All that means is he worked for the local church territory. He answered to the local cardinal, not directly to the Pope. So he was working inside the church's established system, not above it. So, back to that crazy number, 160,000. How did he get there? Well, the answer changes how you think about what an exorcism even is. For Amorth, it wasn't about freeing one person one time. He counted a single prayer session as one exorcism. He saw possession more like a chronic illness. So one person might need hundreds of these sessions over years and years to finally be free. But to understand the man who would take on demons, we have to look at the man he was before all that. Who was Gabriele Amorth before this strange ministry even began? Turns out, his early life was shaped by conflict. He was born into a family of lawyers, but at just 18 years old, he joined the Italian resistance to fight against fascists and Nazis, and he even earned a military cross for his bravery. That experience as a soldier, plus his later work as a journalist, really created this determined and pretty combative personality that would define his entire career as a priest. And that combative nature, it became his trademark. You might think his biggest fight was against Satan, but really, it was against what he saw as ignorance and skepticism within the Vatican itself. You can just feel the frustration in his own words here. In 1999, the Vatican updated the official rite of exorcism, and Amorth went public, calling it a farce. He truly believed the church was basically tying the hands of its own spiritual soldiers, choosing modern rationalism over ancient tradition. So what was the big deal? Well, his objections really came down to two critical changes. First, the new rules said you couldn't perform exorcisms for evil spells, curses or hexes, which Amorth claimed was what he was dealing with 90% of the time. But second, and this was the real kicker, it said a priest had to be certain of possession before they could even start the rite. For Amorth, that was just impossible. He believed the rite itself was the only way to find out for sure. And he did not hold back. He said, very publicly, that the cardinals and theologians who wrote these new rules were just academics in an office who had never actually seen an exorcism. He felt they were totally and dangerously out of touch with what he was facing every single day. And this whole internal church fight really points to a much bigger conflict, that modern struggle to draw a line between demonic possession and mental illness. It's really important to get this. The official process is actually designed to be incredibly cautious. The church knows it's living in a scientific age, so it requires this strict screening process. Before an exorcist ever gets involved, a person has to see doctors and psychiatrists to rule out every known physical or psychological cause. So, after all those other explanations are off the table, what are they looking for? Well, these are the classic signs the church believes point to real possession. Things that by their very nature are supposed to defy any normal scientific explanation. The bar for this is set incredibly high. And this, coming from Amorth's own statements, might just be the most surprising fact of all. Despite his reputation, he saw himself as the first line of defense against unnecessary exorcisms. He claimed that out of every 100 people who came to him for help, he sent 98 of them to a psychiatrist. His entire life's work, all 160,000 of those sessions, was focused on that tiny, exceptional 2%. So what was the ultimate impact of this man? He didn't just perform exorcisms. You could argue he single-handedly triggered a global revival of the whole practice. His influence went way beyond his own little room. He co-founded the International Association of Exorcists to train up a new generation. Then, a university in Rome started offering courses, and in 2014, in what must have felt like a huge personal victory, the Vatican gave his organization its official blessing. He had managed to take exorcism from this fading, almost forgotten practice and turn it into an established, growing ministry. He really put that old journalism background to work. His books became international bestsellers, and he was on TV all the time, which led directly to a massive explosion in demand for exorcists. In his home country of Italy, the number of people asking for help has reportedly just skyrocketed, and you can trace that almost entirely back to his public profile. And this is where the story gets really ironic. The Hollywood movie that made him famous all over the world, it was publicly trashed by his own organization. The IAE called it unreliable splatter cinema, saying it completely distorted the very ministry he fought his whole life to legitimize. It turned a serious pastoral practice into a cheap horror movie. Which brings us to a final, really perplexing question. Amorth himself had a theory. He believed that as traditional faith goes down, superstition rushes in to fill the gap. But whether you think he was a saint or a showman, his life forces us all to ask a very modern mystery. In an age of science, why is the demand for this ancient rite of exorcism not fading away, but actually growing?